graders. Today we're going to learn about fairy tales and read a fairy tale story. But first, let's go over fairy tale features. So, fairy tales have good characters versus evil characters. Good characters versus evil characters. And say it with me. Good characters versus evil characters. If you look at this illustration, you can see that the evil character is the big bad wolf, and the good characters are the three little pigs. Another fairy tale feature is that many fairy tales have magic. In this illustration, you can see that there's a fairy godmother who is transforming this pumpkin into a carriage for Cinderella to get to the ball. Now, I use the word many because not all fairy tales have magic, but many of them do. That means some. Another fairy tale feature that is in all of the fairy tales is that fairy tales are fiction. Fiction means fake. Fiction means fake. Fiction means fake. And one of the things that helps me to remember that fiction means fake is that they both start with an F or a F sound. If you look at this picture, you can see that there's a cricket, a bug, talking to a puppet. That is something that could never happen in real life. And every time Pinocchio lies, his nose grows bigger and bigger and bigger. That is fake. That could not happen. Another fairy tale feature is that all fairy tales have happy endings. All fairy tales have happy endings. All fairy tales have happy endings. The bad character usually dies or disappears. Now, if you were paying very, very close attention, you might have noticed something. I repeated 3 different fairy tale features 3 times. That's because the number 3 is another fairy tale feature. Things are frequently repeated 3 times in fairy tales. You might have 3 little bears, 3 little pigs, 3 wishes. The number 3 occurs in many fairy tales. Another number that's in a lot of fairy tales is the number 7. You might have the 7 dwarves. But in every single fairy tale, we have a happy ending. That bad character never bothers the good character ever again. They live happily ever after. Another fairy tale feature is that many fairy tales begin with once upon a time. Again, not all fairy tales, but many of them do. There are fairy tales from all over the world. This is actually one of my favorite parts about learning about fairy tales and reading them, is that there are stories from every different culture. Here I provided 5 different Cinderella stories. We have an American version, we have an Egyptian Cinderella, a Persian Cinderella, an African Cinderella, and a Native American Cinderella. Now, some of you might say, you know what, Cinderella's a girl, I don't want to read about a princess, I don't like magic. Well, none of the fairy tale features have to involve a princess or a prince. As you can see, we had once upon a time, the bad character dies or disappears, happy endings, fiction, magic, once upon a time. So I'm going to show you another Cinderella story, just a little clip of one that might make you rethink what a Cinderella story is. So here is one, and it's about basketball. It's called Like Mike.
All his life, Calvin Cambridge had been pushed around.
Wanna put me one-on-one?
Something?
And Michael Jordan went back down from no challenge.
And neither is Calvin Cambridge.
But no,
In that, you could see there's bad characters, there's evil characters, and good characters.
no matter how hard he tried,
Take a number, Ox, because you're about to be served.
nothing ever changed. Until one night.
That right there, you could see, was fiction. That's fake.
Tonight, some lucky fan will get to go one-on-one with Tracy Reynolds for $1,000. Here we go. Section 4, row 14, sheet 2.
I got the ticket.
Let's get the show on the road.
Now,
Make me like Mike.
a kid kid with something to prove.
Good luck to you, all right?
I know it was like that.
Yeah, you know like that?
He's taking his game to a whole new level.
Relax out, little man. Recess is over. Come on, little man. Come on.
And hanging with the big boys.
And you can see that there's some magic in those shoes that he has. If you want to see if this movie has the rest of the fairy tale features, I encourage you to watch it. It's called Like Mike. So back to our fairy tale features. Okay, there are fairy tales from all over the world, and there are many different fairy tales that you might not have even noticed are fairy tales in the movies and the books that you're reading. Another important thing about fairy tales is that fairy tales teach a lesson. So in every single fairy tale that we read, even if it's something that we don't think we can relate to, there's something that we can learn from it, and that's a lesson. So I'm going to read a Cinderella story, a traditional Cinderella story, and I want you to keep all of these fairy tale features in your mind, and then we'll talk about them after. So let's get started. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful girl named Cinderella. She was so kind that even the mice and the birds were her friends. Each morning, the birds woke her from her sweet dreams with their song. Cinderella lived with her cruel stepmother and her two stepsisters, Anastasia and Drizella. They treated her like a servant. Cinderella had to do all the cooking and sewing and washing and scrubbing. Her stepsisters never did any work. One day, a royal messenger came to the house. He brought a letter from the king. The stepmother read the letter. The king was giving a royal ball for the prince that night. Every girl in the kingdom was invited. That means I can go? Cinderella cried. Her stepsisters laughed. Imagine Cinderella dancing with the prince, Drizella cackled. She's only fit to dance with a broom, added Anastasia. But the letter says every girl is invited, Cinderella insisted. So it does, the stepmother agreed. You may go if you get all your work done and if you can find something to wear. Oh, thank you, said Cinderella. She quickly ran up to her room. Cinderella pulled a dress out of her trunk. This was my mother's dress, she told the mice. Isn't it lovely? It just needs some decoration. Cinderella's mice had never seen her so happy. A thin mouse named Jack thought Cinderella would be the prettiest girl at the ball. A fat mouse named Gus agreed. Cinderella took out her sewing basket. I'll need a sash and some beads, she said. Just then, her stepmother shouted, Cinderella! Cinderella hurried downstairs. Cinderella, wash the floors, her stepmother ordered. But I washed them yesterday, Cinderella said. Well, wash them again, snapped the cruel woman, and dust the drapes and clean the windows, and finish the sewing. The mice felt sorry for Cinderella. Cinderella do this, Cinderella do that, Jack said. Cinderella will never have time to fix her dress. Then her stepmother won't have to let her go to the ball. Poor Cinderella, Gus agreed. One of the mice had an idea. Why don't we fix the dress for Cinderella? We can do it. All the animals agreed to help. Gus and Jack sneaked into the stepsisters' room. Drizella and Anastasia were getting ready for the ball. This sash is old, Anastasia said. These beads are horrible, Drizella said. They threw their things away. Gus and Jack took the sash and the beads. Pretty, pretty, Gus exclaimed. Shh, Jack hissed. He was afraid they would wake Lucifer the cat. But the mice made it safely back to the attic. Soon, every beak and paw was busy. The animals... I skipped ahead. The animals measured and cut and sewed while they worked. Cinderella helped her stepsisters with their gowns. Soon it was time to leave for the ball. Why, Cinderella, her stepmother sneered. You are not ready, what a shame. Cinderella slowly climbed the stairs to her room. Oh well, what's a royal ball, she said. It would probably be dull and boring, and Cinderella sighed. Completely wonderful. But her dress wasn't finished. She couldn't go. Cinderella opened the door to her room. Surprise! Shouted the mice and birds. Cinderella thought she was dreaming. Her dress was beautiful. Oh, thank you, Cinderella told her little friends. She put on the gown and hurried downstairs. Isn't my dress lovely? May I go to the ball? Cinderella asked. Anastasia and Drizella gasped. Mother, she can't! Well, we did have a bargain, began the stepmother. At that moment, the sisters recognized the things they'd thrown away. My sash! Anastasia wailed. My beads! Drizella shrieked. The sisters tore at Cinderella's gown. They took back the sash and the beads. Cinderella was left in rags. Then Drizella and Anastasia went to the ball with their mother. Cinderella ran into the garden. She tried to remember her sweet dreams, but she didn't think they would ever come true. Her animal friends had never seen her so sad. There's nothing left to believe in, nothing, Cinderella sobbed. She didn't notice the lights that twinkled and danced all around her, but Jock and Gus did. They could hardly believe their eyes. The lights turned into a kind-looking woman. The woman patted Cinderella's head. She said, "You must believe in something, or I couldn't be here. And here I am, so dry your tears. Now where did I put my wand?" The woman was Cinderella's fairy godmother. Everything she needed to help Cinderella was right in the garden. The fairy godmother waved her wand. Bibbidi-bobbidi-boo! 4 mice became 4 white horses. Bibbidi-bobbidi-boo! A pumpkin turned into a beautiful coach. A horse became the coachman, and a dog became the footman. The fairy godmother was very pleased. Hop in, my dear. We can't waste time, she urged. Don't you think my dress, Cinderella began. Good heavens, child, you can't go like that, said the fairy godmother. Bibbidi-bobbidi-boo! Suddenly Cinderella was wearing the gown of her dreams, and on her feet she wore glass slippers. The fairy godmother said, like all my dreams, my magic must end. At midnight the spell will be broken. Cinderella promised to be home before midnight. Off she rode to the ball. The ball had already begun. The king was not very happy. He wanted his son to marry. The prince had danced with all the girls at the ball, but he had not fallen in love with any of them. Love at first sight only happens in fairy tales, the Duke told the king. At that moment, Cinderella made her entrance. The prince stared in wonder. Here was the girl of his dreams. The prince asked Cinderella to dance. Cinderella and the prince danced around the ballroom. Everyone wondered about the beautiful girl. Do we know her? Drizella asked. The prince seems to, Anastasia said jealously. There is something familiar about her, the stepmother said. When the dance ended, Cinderella and the prince walked in the garden. They were falling in love. Suddenly, the clock began to strike midnight. I must go, cried Cinderella. Wait, called the prince, but Cinderella couldn't wait. As she fled, she lost one of her glass slippers. The prince showed the glass slipper to the Duke. Find the girl whose foot fits this slipper. I will marry her, the prince said. Meanwhile, Cinderella's dress had become rags again. The coach was now a pumpkin. The horses had become mice again, and the coachman and footman had turned back into a horse and a dog. All Cinderella had left was one glass slipper. The Duke searched the entire kingdom for the girl whose foot fit the slipper. Soon everyone knew that the prince would marry that girl. When Cinderella heard this, she got a dreamy look in her eyes. The stepmother saw the dreamy look. She didn't want Cinderella to marry the prince. So she locked Cinderella in her room. The stepmother put the key in her pocket and left. Gus and Jock saw everything. "We've got to get that key, Jock cried. Gus agreed. The two brave mice managed to get the key from the stepmother's pocket. They struggled to get the big heavy key up the stairs. Jock and Gus had to hurry. The Duke had just arrived. His footman carried the glass slipper. Anastasia tried on the slipper. Her foot was much too big. Drizella tried next. She couldn't even fit her toes into the slipper. Are there any other ladies in the house?" asked the Duke. "There is no one else," the stepmother answered. The Duke was about to leave when Cinderella came down the stairs. Jock and Gus had freed her. "May I try on the slipper?" she asked, but the cruel stepmother tripped the footman. The footman fell and the slipper broke. Luckily, Cinderella had the other glass slipper in her pocket. Of course, it fit perfectly. Cinderella and the prince were soon married. It was Cinderella's dream come true. Jock and Gus weren't surprised because they always knew that if you keep on believing, that's just what dreams do. And that is the end of the story. So, very quickly, what we're going to go over is what the fairy tale features that we saw in Cinderella are and how they relate to what we just learned. So, who are the good characters and the evil characters? Well, Cinderella is the good character, and the evil characters are her step-family, her step-sisters, and her step-mom. And there are 3 of them, which is another fairy tale feature. There are 3 evil characters. We know that there's magic in this fairy tale too. The fairy godmother is a magic character. We know that this is a fiction story. There are animals that are talking, and there is magic, and there's lots of things that could never happen in real life. This ended with a happy ending. Cinderella got to marry the prince, and the bad characters disappeared. We don't see the stepmother and the stepsisters in her life at the very end. She gets to live with the prince in the castle and be royal and have a happy life. I can't quite remember if it had Once Upon a Time, but you'll have to go back and see if it did. And we know that this is a Cinderella story. This was the original, but we have different ones from all around the world. And lastly, what lesson can we learn? Well, at the very end, it said, Jock and Gus weren't surprised because they always knew that if you keep on believing, that's just what dreams do. So never stop believing, and that is the lesson that you're supposed to take is follow your dreams, keep believing, things will happen good for you. Thank you for listening to my story on Cinderella and listening to all these fairy tale features. I hope you learned something new, and I can't wait to teach you guys tomorrow.